The situation in France is currently so fractious and indeed violent that they've called off the King's visit. That's quite a big deal. I try and think of other countries where you've gone in the blink of an eye from, yeah, we'll have the old king over for a quick visit to, oh, sacre bleu. You better not come, mate. Things are really hairy over here. And what they are hairy about is retirement age, the age at which you can enjoy the full benefits of your retirement, which I presume is more generous than it is here, although I am going to be educated this hour by you. And what they are cross about is the insistence by Macron, who's bypassed Parliament to do so, on the grounds of a kind of economic necessity to raise the retirement age in France from 62 to 64. It's currently 66, if you keep up with such things in this country, and it was due to rise again, although in a rather grim illustration of the state of the nation, there are now suggestions that it won't rise again because life expectancy is coming down. So the nature of protest is what fascinates me. The role of protest in France is what fascinates me, because it falls to me to remind you once again that the government we currently have in Westminster believes that the laws in this country regarding public protest are too lax, that the jackboot, if you like, of state control over public protest should be brought down harder upon the windpipe of the population. And if you look at the UK in isolation, and forgive me, and you are a bit of an idiot, then you can probably understand or even feel some support for Priti Patel's idea that particularly climate change protesters should be treated a lot more harshly, even not violently necessarily, but certainly a lot more harshly than they currently are. And then you hop over to France and you've got over 1 million people taking to the streets in protest at something as straightforward and simple as a pension rise. So you'll have noticed I haven't got my question clarified at this point. I kind of just want to say something vague and then ask you to crystallise it, ask you to clarify it. And I think I know what vague question I want to ask you. My only reservation at this point is how many people listening to the programme will be qualified to answer it. But if you remember when we were doing our Brexit phone-ins, there were days when I confined all calls to the continental Europe. You weren't allowed to. Well, you were allowed to, but you didn't. We had switchboards groaning under the weight of calls from every corner of Europe. I'm confident-ish that we can do the same today with France. So, public protest is the question. The relationship between public protest and politics. I want you to, if you can, explain to me the key differences, the crucial areas of difference between, I'm going to say England at the first hurdle rather than Britain, between England and France. What is it that is so different, culturally or historically? And I want you to educate me, okay? I'm not suggesting for a minute that anybody listening is as ignorant as I am, but this might have its roots in revolution. It might have its roots in the secular nation of the French state. It's about because we remember the Gilets jaunes not long ago, a movement that was very confused and confusing, but very impressive in terms of scale and volume. As I glance at the screen in the studio at the moment, there are braziers burning on the streets of Paris, and I think in one southern city they set fire to the town hall. There is tear gas wafting its way through the assembled masses. You can see why King Charles has decided not to go. When was he due to go? It must have been pretty imminently, was it? So they've called that trip off because it looks not unlike a war zone. What intrigues me is this difference in population, the differences between the French and the English when it comes to public protest, because they do it an awful lot, and they do it on a much grander scale than we pretty much ever do. I like the tradition of peaceful protest in this country, but it is rather different to the tradition of protest in France that almost looks violent, often looks close to violent. So that's what I want to understand. There's something in the DNA. There's something in the French culture, the French history, that has incubated a different relationship with public protest to the one that we have here. I wonder whether deference gets a look in again, as it did in the last hour. That Scottish history seems to have bred less deference to what we might call the landlord class than English history has. I find Scottish politics or the Scottish people less deferential. That sort of know your place and ask no questions seems to me to be a peculiarly English phenomenon, and one that France, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't have. Certainly the rejection of the royal family and the rejection of the nobility would suggest some form of opposition to deference in general and in particular. But that doesn't necessarily explain the full shift as you cross the English Channel from a population that never really protests violently, except in deeply unpleasant scenarios like outside asylum centres or similar, to a country just a short hop over the Channel where the history of violent protest, the role of violent protest, seems to me to be very different. So talk to me about it. That's all. I'm not feigning ignorance on this. Like most Brits, I'm woefully ill-equipped to talk about other countries and other cultures with much knowledge or depth. And it is even more woeful, of course, the closer that country is. And maybe I've got it all completely wrong, and you don't recognise what I'm seeking to describe as a closer relationship between protest and population, a different relationship between protest and population. And of course, if you're there and you're following events closely, give us an update. What's likely to happen? Is Macron going to have to? Is there a point at which Macron steps down or stands down, steps back? I don't think he's going to leave office. But the idea that he has forced this legislation through Parliament or forced it into the statute books by passing votes, it does look from the outside pretty egregious. 2 words, says Robin Leeds. Madame Guillotine. Is it that simple, do you think? The idea that the French learnt long ago that you can actually affect the ultimate change through mass movements on streets, and therefore mass movements on streets have a weight and a resonance in France that they will never have here, because we ain't never had no revolution.